When I was young, my family had a rule that when we sat down to dinner, we did not answer the phone. My parents always said if it was important, people would call back. Now, this was back in the dark ages before answering phones and voicemail. With 2 working parents, a family business, and 5 kids, it was hard, but dinner was the one time of day that Mom and Dad insisted that we all be together. To Mom's dismay, I can remember my dad acting really goofy and making us laugh, and sometimes that had unfortunate results when we were eating. And I also remember a brother who would punch me in the arm when Mom and Dad weren't looking, but I won't say any more about that. I can also remember lots of discussion around the table about the family business, about school and friends and things that were happening in the world. Today it's very hard, I think, sometimes for families to sit down together. It seems terribly outdated, and yet sometimes I really long for the days before we had cell phones and computers. It seemed like there was more time for conversation face to face and for quietness and rest. Seemed like it anyway. Now, I do enjoy the convenience of our tech gadgets. I mean, social media has made it possible for me to stay in touch with seminary friends who are serving across the country and family who are far away. And I can also see the benefits of parents who can keep in touch with their kids no matter where they are these days. And I certainly feel safer driving with my cell phone in case I have an accident or a breakdown. But as with all things, technology also has a shadow side, doesn't it? Our devices are almost always on, providing constant background noise. And sometimes they can become quite intrusive. And I'd like to give you a personal example. On my phone, sometimes I like to play games. And there's this one game, it's a number, I like puzzles, so there's this number puzzle, and I won't tell you the name of it because it's terribly addictive. But I like playing with numbers. I used to work with numbers a lot. So it's sequencing multiples of different numbers. And over the course of the year, I couldn't tell you how many hours I wasted playing that game. I would start it, and next thing you know, 2 hours had gone by or more. It was just absolutely incredible. And I finally realized that I had to delete that game because I just wouldn't leave it alone if it was on my phone. The instant availability of data is causing our human attention span to decrease. There are studies that are showing this these days. And we allow it, and we pay a price. We lose sleep because of our gadgets. I don't know if you realize that. That blue light that comes from our gadgets interferes with our natural sleep patterns. We in the modern world are the most sleep-deprived people ever. And our devices can pull our attention away from those who are right in front of us. How many times have we been in restaurants and seen 2 people sitting across from each other, each on their phones? Our phones are always on. The problem is that our relationships can suffer, but our spiritual lives also can be impacted. With all of the interruptions of modern life, it's hard to focus sometimes. It's hard to focus. And it especially can be hard to focus on prayer. It can be hard to just be quiet, to be still, to just simply rest in God's presence. Our electronic devices have, of course, increased the problem, but distractions and stuff that interfere with our focus, that's not new. That's not new, not even close. There's always been something. In today's text, it's a continuation of what we heard last week in the gospel. Jesus was in the synagogue, and he was preaching and teaching and leading worship. In today's text, it's still that same day, the Sabbath day. And it's already been a full day. Jesus had led worship. He was teaching when this man stands up and challenges him right in the middle of worship. He just stands up and says, "What have you got to do with us?" But Jesus has compassion for the man, and he stops his teaching right in the middle of worship and heals him of his illness. But then Jesus heads home with Peter. And at his arrival, he finds out that Peter's mother-in-law is ill with a fever. And in the first century, a fever, an illness that we might consider very minor, could quickly become fatal. But Jesus lifts her up. He touches her and he heals her. And she is then empowered to wholeness and to her dignity as the female head of household. And we hear through the scripture that she served her guests, an honor that she could bestow because Jesus had healed her. And still, Jesus' day isn't over. As the story continues, we hear that after sundown, there is a crowd that gathers at Peter's door. Why sundown, you wonder? Because all of this had happened in the synagogue earlier. Because Sabbath is measured from sundown to sundown. And so now that the sun is down, the Sabbath is over, and people can get out of their houses and move about. And the buzz about what Jesus did in the synagogue has spread like wildfire all over town. And they all show up at the door. Can you imagine how tired Jesus was already? And yet he goes out to all of the folks who gather at the door. All of those who have gathered seeking healing and help for their loved ones. And he heals the ones who have been brought to him. And Mark's gospel is very terse. He doesn't tell us how long Jesus was at it. I have to imagine it was hours. Now, I don't know about Pastor Alex because she's still young, but when I was preaching full-time, most Sundays I took a nap right after lunch because I was just done, exhausted. Being an introvert, being in front, took a lot out of me. Now, Alex seems to be rather an extrovert rather, and it seems like she's energized. But still, what happens is that preaching and teaching were only the first few hours of Jesus' day. So I can only imagine how bone tired he was. But what Mark tells us happens next is really important. He says, very early the next morning, before daybreak, Jesus slips away from the house. He goes off to a place that's deserted, where it's quiet, where he can unplug from the world for a while, where he can be still and rest in God's presence. And it's during that still, quiet time that Jesus rests his body, he renews his strength, he recharges his spirit by spending time in prayer, connecting with God. Jesus is very clear that God is the source of all of his strength. His resolve and his resilience come from taking time to be with God. And while he is alone and unplugged, he also has an opportunity to focus on the core of his mission to preach the gospel, to preach and teach the good news that God's kingdom is here in the present and now. And he reminds his disciples of that as he comes back to them, that his message isn't just for the good people of Capernaum, but to all of Galilee and eventually to Judea. Throughout Jesus' life and ministry, we will witness this habit that he had of unplugging from the world to renew his strength. He would go off to a quiet place, and he would pray and just be in God's presence. During the season of Lent coming up toward Holy Week, as you listen carefully to the scriptures, you will hear about this habit more than once. You'll hear it several times. Jesus had this habit of doing this regularly, but at crucial turning points in his ministry, he especially took that time to go and be with God. We see it here at the beginning of his ministry. We see it after he has healed at the Sabbath and he's tired. We will see him go off alone and just be with God before he sets his face to Jerusalem and the cross, and we witness him doing it again as he prays in the garden before he's arrested. We can easily become distracted by the noise and the turmoil around us each day, and we can get so caught up in the minutia that we often waste a lot of time and energy on things that aren't as important. And sometimes we forget to take that time to connect with God, who's the source of our strength. God lays out this great feast before us, and yet sometimes, even though it's right in front of us, we're going hungry because we forget to take it. Even health experts these days tell us that it's vital to unplug from the world on a regular basis. To be healthy, they say, we need time to rest our bodies, minds, and spirits. In other words, to be whole and holy, it's important to make time to rest our bodies, to be still, to feed our minds, and to nurture our spiritual lives. And for those of us who follow Jesus, that means deepening our relationship with God through our worship and the sacraments, study, and especially quiet time in prayer. And it's not a selfish thing to do. It's a very wise thing to do. Because taking time to rest and renew enables us to be available to those that we love, to be available to God's call for us to love and to serve our neighbors. And it's scriptural, because Jesus, who is the Son of God, if he needed to take this time apart to unplug from the world, then how much more do we need to do that? And I know when we're working, when we have so many things going on, it's very hard to take time for ourselves to unplug. Even in retirement, I sometimes find a hard time. But it's important to keep working at it and strengthening that habit to unplug. How about you? Do you have a habit or a practice that helps you to unplug from the world? Our challenge is to be as intentional as Jesus was, so that we might be available to those we love and available to God's call to love and serve our neighbors. And as we heard in the words of the prophet Isaiah, God is the source of our strength, and I'd like you to hear them again. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. May it be so.